Welcome everybody to our first Australian Cardine Institute webinar for 2022. Some of you may have attended some of our earlier ones last year. And this year, our initial focus will be on lay apostolates, looking forward to the Australian Plenary Council, the second assembly of which will take place in July this year. So just as we often do, we'll start with a shortened version of the plenary prayer, which I'll read for everyone. Come, Holy Spirit of Pentecost. Come, Holy Spirit of the Great Southland. O God, bless and unite all your people in Australia and guide us on the pilgrim way of the Plenary Council. And the second thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge country, as we often do today. And since we're a national gathering, I'll do it in a more general sense. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of Australia and other nations, if there are any international visitors. We pay our respects to the elders past and present, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation and all Indigenous peoples around the world. And actually, in a sense, we're also, the purpose of tonight is also to kind of hold our memories, or perhaps regain our memories of part of our own tradition, being the Campion Society, and to connect that with the Plenary Council. The title that we're using is the Campion Society and the Development of the Lay Apostolate in Australia. From the point of view of ACI, as we call ourselves for short, one of our priorities has been to promote the Vatican II and the Cardine conception of the specifically lay apostolates. If you follow the council, you might kind of notice and feel that that concept has been a little bit absent to date. So we've got 6 months to hopefully raise some awareness of that point. And what better way to do that than by recalling perhaps the first great lay apostolate movement in Australia, the Campion Society. I found in preparing this week, I found a very interesting little quote from Archbishop Mannix, I think in 1949, in which he said that the Campion Society, almost every major effort made by Catholics in Australia in recent years was rooted in the Campion Society. That's really a high level of praise. And of course, he was talking about many movements that emerged. There was a Secretariat of Catholic Action, the Young Christian Workers, Young Christian Students, National Catholic Rural Movement, and many others, which I'm sure we'll hear about tonight. So I'm sure you're actually interested to hear those people who will be speaking. I'll just mention their names for a beginning, and I'll introduce Colin more. Before I go on to that, I just wanted to also acknowledge the sons and daughters of a number of the Campions who are here with us tonight. So there's Anne Kelly and Barbara Kelly Cooper, daughters of Kevin T. Kelly, Jacinta Heffy and Marilyn Puglisi, daughters of Jared, Carl Schmood, son of Alf Schmood, Paul Santamaria, son of Bob. And there may be others in the audience, and I'll offer the opportunity later to recall those people as well. But to go on tonight, to get us launched on the way, we have two speakers, Colin Jory on the Campion Society itself, and Richard Doig on the National Catholic Rural Movement, which is one of the many initiatives which emerged from the Campion Society. I'll introduce Colin. He was born in Albury, where he was educated by the Mercy Nuns and the Christian Brothers, and later at St. Patrick's College, Ballarat, where he actually boarded with the future Cardinal George Pell. He went on a scholarship to ANU, on a Teachers College scholarship, and pursued a history honours degree. In the course of those studies, he determined to take on a master's degree, and the person he approached for that was the famous historian Manning Clark. It turns out, actually, I just discovered this week, that Manning Clark also comes from Geelong, and was studying at Melbourne Uni in the early 30s, which may be a reason he was interested in Colin's project. After that, Colin went on to get a PhD scholarship, more in the literary field on Hamlet. and he's pursued his career since then, active in church affairs as a founding member of the John the 23rd Fellowship, which later became the Campion Fellowship of Australia. So Colin, I'd like to hand over to you now to present a short summary, it must be, of your thesis and book. Thank you.
Colin, your microphone is not turned on.
Is that working now?
Yes, it's working. And I can just advise everyone too, if you want to switch to speaker view, that allows you to see Colin. In the speaker view, it should be at the top right-hand side of your screen if you're using desktops, and that will give you access to large screen of the speakers. Yes, Colin, you're right to go now.
All right. I was saying that what I'm going to do is put the screen script of my paper in front of me, which means that I won't be able to see you until I finish. Then I'll switch it back again. But that means that if you want to make any rude gestures to me or poke faces, then I'm not going to see them. Okay, so at least until I finish. So I'm just switching that across in front of me. You can see me fine. You can see my face, but from here I can't see yours. All right. Oh, cracks. Sorry, I've popped up the wrong one. Geez, that's a real. Here we are. Okay, my studies on the Campion Society originated late in 1966 in the history department of the Australian National University, when I discussed with Professor C. Manning Clark what I should do for my history honours thesis the following year. I said that I wanted to do something which was Australian, Catholic, but not political. Without a moment's hesitation, Manning responded, "Go down to Melbourne and find out about the Campion Society." I later learned that he had already been looking for the right horse for that particular course, because he had been enormously impressed by the Campion Society when he was at Melbourne University in the 1930s and had seen it in action. I did the honours thesis, which was well received. However, I still had questions in mind regarding Catholic actionism in the 1930s, which I wanted to pursue. One being why Catholic lay intellectual and social activism flourished much better in Victoria than in Sydney. So I again approached Manning Clark, who obtained for me an ANU Master's degree scholarship, so I could do a thesis expanding on my earlier one. I worked on this thesis in 1971 to 72. For each thesis, Manning was my supervisor. My master's thesis was published in 1986 at the instigation of my cousin, the late Peter Thomas of Liverpool, Sydney, as the Campion Society in Catholic Social Militancy in Australia, 1929 to 1939, with a foreword by Manning Clark. The Campion Society sprang into life at Melbourne University in early 1931. It was a product of the times in which it was born, which was in the worst phase of the Great Depression. Everywhere was economic chaos and political despair, and there had arisen widespread suspicions in Catholic circles, as in others, that the whole existing political and social order had failed and needed replacing. Thus, Melbourne's main Catholic weekly, The Advocate, despaired in December 1930 that since, I quote, "the Labor government has failed more lamentably and completely than any other, it would seem that the capitalist system is incapable of producing that just distribution of wealth on which the country's welfare depends," unquote. Not even Melbourne University could escape the intellectual and social ferment which was unleashed throughout the world by the Depression. The traditional facade of student aloofness from the mundane affairs of the world began to crumble. Many on the campus began to search for a permanent solution to the existing chaos in a new and better social order. And as elsewhere, increasing numbers looked for salvation to Soviet Russia as it appeared to them from communist propaganda. The Catholics on the campus were largely immune to the idealisation of Russia and communism. In their Catholic schools, they'd been well versed in Catholic doctrine, and so they near universally regarded communism in theory and in practice as a positive evil. Yet the means for obtaining an intellectual appreciation of the Church's objections to communism were not readily available to the average student. The Newman Society was merely a social club, and Catholicism did not constitute an intellectual force on the campus. However, late in 1930, the secretary of the Newman Society, Murray McInerney, who would eventually become a justice of the Victorian Supreme Court, posted a circular to all known Catholic graduates, several hundreds of them, requesting their advice and assistance regarding possible Catholic intellectual activities at the university. The response was dismal, but one who responded was a young arts graduate and law student named Frank Marr. They each contacted friends whom they thought might be interested and suitable. These friends contacted others, and on the 28th of January 1931, they all met, 8 of them. As I tell in my Campion book, all were apprehensive and pessimistic, and at first the conversation seemed to be going nowhere. Then one of the 8, Dennis Jackson, took issue with another, Frank Quain, on some point, and as Marr recalled, I quote, "He quickly became neither vague nor formal nor silent. He and Quain saved us. We'd come together because we felt that we were painfully ignorant of the modern Catholic approach to life, because we had realised we were being poisoned by slow degrees in the pagan atmosphere in which we lived. So we listened humbly and gratefully while Jackson and Quain gave off fireworks about Latin culture and the neo-scholasticism of Maritain. We were dazzled and delighted," unquote. All the others were affected in much the same way. Excited by the success of their first meeting, the 8 met again on the 11th of February and each fortnight after that. As their first focal text, they studied Survivals and New Arrivals, Hilaire Belloc's vigorous defence of Catholic belief against the diverse challenges of what he termed the new paganism. The impact of this work was decisive. Over the succeeding weeks, they began to familiarise themselves with the Central Catholic Library, being assisted and encouraged by its founder and manager, the Irish Jesuit Father William Hackett. They became acquainted with the leading writers of the English Catholic literary revival, and with such works as Belloc's The Servile State and Europe and the Faith, G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man, Christopher Dawson's The Age of the Gods, and W.T. Walsh's The 13th Greatest of Centuries. As Gerard Heffy later testified, they, quote, infected one another with enthusiasm, became filled with scorn of a decadent paganism, unquote. Their conviction grew that, quote, the Church made Europe and that everything good of which our modern world can boast has its origins in that age when, with all its defects, men proudly acknowledged a citizenship in a Christendom and a standard of values that are fast disappearing, unquote. After a couple of months, those involved realised that they had evolved a distinctive identity. Where the Catholicism of those around them tended to be defensive, theirs had acquired an assertive Chestertonian quality. Where others interpreted the Catholic faith intellectually in terms of traditional apologetics, they did so by reference also to its contribution to Western civilization. They thought of the Church not as a static entity, but as a dynamic force in a desperately confused world. In April, they resolved to adopt a name, that of the brilliant Elizabethan Jesuit and martyr Edmund Campion. They obtained Archbishop Manix's permission to function as a Catholic organisation calling itself the Campion Society. During 1931, the Campion Society expanded from 8 to 15 members, and late in the year it began to exert an influence beyond its own ranks. The members made contact with the 4 Melbourne Catholic secondary boys' schools, which had matriculation classes: St Kevin's Christian Brothers College, St Patrick's Christian Brothers, De La Salle College, Melbourne, and Xavier College, in the hope of persuading those senior students who would be going on to Melbourne University to join their ranks when they arrived there. At the beginning of 1932, the society doubled in size to 31 members and divided itself into 3 groups. Among the new recruits were Kevin Kelly, Stan Ingwerson and Bob Santamaria. An immensely important and effective means of extending the Campion influence was found in the Catholic Young Men's Society, a very strong, proud and populous organisation with 32 branches in Melbourne and about the same number in country Victoria. The CYMS was mainly a sporting body. However, it had a thriving debating competition which attracted the more intellectually talented of its members, a few of whom attended the university. From the CYMS debaters came much of the Catholic lay leadership of Victoria. Beginning in April 1932, Campion Society members began giving talks to CYMS branches. Also, during 1932, the Society was invited to speak to the seminarians at Corpus Christi College, Werribee, the Jesuit-run seminary for the Victorian diocesan clergy. Further to this, the Society, through its members acting independently, began to exert a strong influence on the Melbourne University Newman Society and the Melbourne University Debating Society. By 1933, the Campion Society had developed a coherent course of studies for its members. In this, it supplemented delvings into the Church's cultural achievements in the West with detailed analyses of paganising movements and ideologies in the contemporary world, and with the study of the papal social encyclicals, Rerum Novarum, 1891, and Quadragesimo Anno, 1931. Campion groups were founded during 1934 in the Victorian country centres of Ballarat, Geelong and Wangaratta, and in the New South Wales border city of Albury. In every case, the group was closely intertwined with the local CYMS. An enthusiastic member of the Albury Campion was a certain Alf Schmuder, the father of Carl Schmuder. From that same year, the Campions also contributed a plethora of articles to the CYMS magazine, The Catholic Young Man, on topics both historical and contemporary social. Dennis Jackson was given a permanent column in The Advocate, which he was to continue writing for more than 40 years. 1934 was also the year in which a Campion Society was formed in Sydney by Desmond O'Connor, a law student who would later become a Jesuit. In South Australia, a Campion-type organisation, the Catholic Guild for Social Studies, had been founded in 1932 in unawareness of the Melbourne Campion by Dominic Paul Maguire, who would become the most influential Australian Catholic activist and intellectual of his generation on the international scene. A short-lived Campion group was founded in Brisbane in 1932, but it was not until 1936 that a successful Brisbane Campion Society began. Late in the decade, a Campion-type organisation, the Chesterton Club, was founded in Western Australia. During the second half of the 1930s, the most important and spectacular achievements of the Campion Society were its inspiring the foundation of the Australian Catholic Worker in February 1936 under the editorship of Bob Santamaria. It's inspiring various of its key members to play a prominent role in the anti-republican cause in Melbourne in relation to the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39, and it's persuading the Australian Catholic bishops, with the exception of Archbishop Michael Kelly of Sydney, to form the Australian National Secretariat of Catholic Action, ANSCA, in September 1937, with Frank Marr as its director and Bob Santamaria its assistant director. The old Campion Society ceased to play a prominent part in Catholic affairs from about the close of the 1930s, and it faded away in the 1950s. Nevertheless, it has had and continues to have a considerable post-mortem influence. Its offspring, the Sydney Campion Society, was influential into the 1950s in inspiring cooperative societies, and it survived into the 1970s. Its story is yet to be told. As for the Australian National Secretariat of Catholic Action, the Campion Society was in its DNA. The work of ANSCA has yet to be thoroughly researched, but Stefan and David Keogh have worked on the history of the young Christian Workers' Movement, and Richard Doig has done a doctoral thesis on the National Catholic Rural Movement, both of which movements were initially at least under the umbrella of ANSCA. The Catholic Worker persisted until 1976, although in character it changed radically in its final decade. Yet in present and future history, the most important influence exercised by the Campion Society will undoubtedly be seen as that which it exerted on Bob Santamaria, who was to have such a profound and protracted impact on Australia's politics and culture. This is ironical because from when Bob initiated the Catholic Worker in 1936, most, although not all, of the senior Campion leaders were wary of him, while recognising his immense talents, and he was never himself a typical Campion leader in that, among other things, in his writings and activities, he showed little interest in the Christian culture of the Middle Ages. That said, shortly after Bob died in 1998, a family friend of my wife and me happened to be listening to ABC radio when an interview with Father Paul Collins came on. Now, I suspect that Paul Collins and I would see eye to eye on very little theologically or politically, although we have in common the fact that Manning Clark supervised and regarded highly thesis by each of us. However, according to the friend, Collins declared, quote, "If you want to understand Santamaria, read Colin Jory's book on the Campion Society," unquote. Had there been no Campion Society, Santamaria's history, and thus 20th century Australian history, would have been significantly different. The most direct ongoing influence of the original Campion Society, however, is certainly that which manifested itself in the Campian Fellowship of Australia and in Campion College at Toongabbie, New South Wales. Carl Schmuder's father, Alf Schmuder, was, as I have said, a member of the Albury branch of the Campion Society in the 1930s. Much later, he became the accountant for the Sydney-based Catholic publishing house of E.J. Dwyer, and his wife, Tess, became the secretary manager of William Charles Wentworth's mansion, Vaucluse House, under the government trust responsible for the house and its lands. Tess's responsibilities included residing in Vaucluse House, which he did with Alf and young Carl. The family lived in the capacious second story of the house, and there Carl grew up, immersing himself in his father's extensive Campion Society library, which is now at Campion College. By providential circumstances, I became acquainted with Carl by correspondence in late 1967, and we met the following year at Sydney University, where I was embarking on my diploma in education and Carl on his diploma in librarianship. Carl had already been attempting to establish an Institute of Christian Culture among friends to centre on Campion-style study groups following a Campion-style study program. Carl and I remained in touch, and we were among those who on 30th of December 1972 founded the John 23rd Fellowship, a loose alliance of intellectually aware young Catholics intent on understanding what was happening in the church and society and working to further the Catholic educational and cultural apostolate. The fellowship was always conscious of its links to the original Campion Society, and on 27th of December 1987, it changed its name to the Campion Fellowship of Australia, although it never adopted Campion Society study programs. Present as a guest when the name change was made was Ronald Conway, who had been the last president of the Victorian Campion Society in the 1950s. Kevin Kelly had been a member of the fellowship since 1984, and at the annual conference that year, he had not been able to sleep on the first night because his mind was abuzz with the new thinking and knowledge regarding Catholic affairs to which he'd been introduced through the papers and discussions of that day. The Campion Fellowship as such was intended from the start to be an association of Catholic activists rather than an activist Catholic association. It did organise national lecture tours by prominent overseas Catholic luminaries. It inspired the foundation in Melbourne by Brian Schaefer of the John 23rd Fellowship Bookshop, later the John 23rd Bookshop, I think it was the John 23rd Fellowship Cooperative Bookshop. It inspired the foundation in America in 1977 of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars, which remains strong, and it engaged in some other corporate activities. However, its only regular collective activity was its annual conference. As a corporate entity, the Campion Fellowship has been dormant since its 2001 annual conference, yet as a small F fellowship of Catholic activists, it remains vital. The aforementioned Campion College is a liberal arts college which opened in 2006 and which, in its own words, aspires to introduce its students to, and I quote, the spiritual, moral, intellectual and cultural traditions of the faith, whilst developing an understanding of the role of Christianity in the history of Western civilization, unquote. The college was a product of the vision of Carl Schmuder and the organisational and financial skills of Brisbane businessman James Powell Sr. And it is, in effect, that Institute of Christian Culture which Carl had sought to engender since the mid-1960s. Carl and James met through a mutual friend, the Brisbane Carmelite prioress Mother Mary Veronica, born Vera McGann, and Carl introduced James to the Campion Fellowship. The college flourishes and has become highly reputed. Interestingly, studies in Western civilization, such as Campion College, derived from the Campion Society via the intermediacy of Alf and Carl Schmuder, have become very modish of recent years in conservative circles in reaction against the progressive education with its disdain for the past of our society and culture. The non-religious Ramsay Institute of Western Civilization is at the forefront in Australia of this reaction, and it has very close relations with Campion College. I shall end by returning to my mentor, Professor C.M.H. Clarke. He is the most famous of the historians of Australia as such, and as can be inferred from what I have already told, the influence on him of the Campion Society at Melbourne University in the 1930s was lifelong. Any reading of his books will reveal that he had a pervasive sense of the tragedy of human life. Man at his best aspires to the high and noble, but always within him is original sin, the old Adam, to drag him down. Manning admired Marxist-Leninism because it was driven by an inspiring vision of human perfectibility. But his deepest empathy came to be with Catholicism, above all because, unlike communism, it recognises that man is and always will be a fallen creature. Manning many times wrote of the decisive effect on his outlook of the great Spanish Civil War debate at Melbourne University on 22nd of March 1937 between three Campion men, Kevin Kelly, Stan Ingwerson and Bob Santamaria, and three well-known left secularists, Nettie Palmer, Jack Legg and Dr. Gerard O'Day. In his 1990 autobiographical book, The Quest for Grace, he gives a vivid account of the occasion, concluding with the reflection, and I quote, "From that night to the present day, I will never be able to decide which side I am on, the side of Catholic truth or the side of the Enlightenment," unquote. However, Manning did decide at the last which side he was on. In his will, he expressed his wish that a Jesuit priest, Father John Eddy, a long-term friend of his, should organise an appropriate religious funeral service for him. That service took place on Monday, 27th of May, 1991 in St Christopher's Cathedral, Canberra, to which Manning had often made private devotional visits. It was a beautiful, profoundly Christian and profoundly Catholic ceremony. Thus, although Manning never converted to Catholicism, he made clear at the end that he died closer to the Catholic faith than to anything else. Had it not been for the witness of the Campion Society long before, I doubt that he would have become that close, and much that he wrote would have been different. Yes. So, there we are.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that enlightening and engrossing introduction to the work of the Campion Society and the Campion leaders and members, and also to their legacy among those various initiatives, and quite an astounding personal legacy in the person of Manning Clark as well. I'm sure there are others who are in our audience or among our participants who'd love to add more to that. But before we hand over to the participants, I think it'd be appropriate to hear from Richard Doig, who will speak of another initiative which had its origin or inspiration in the Campion Society, the National Catholic Rural Movement. A few words about Richard. He's currently a secondary teacher in Victoria with the Victorian Department of Education and Training. He's taught previously in other states, in Queensland, New South Wales, and also in Vietnam, and has been and lectured and tutored at Charles Sturt University and the University of Queensland. He's also been a farmer, which is very appropriate for the subject he's speaking on tonight. And the title of his PhD thesis was The National Catholic Rural Movement and a New Deal for Australia, the Rise and Fall of an Agrarian Movement, 1931-1958. And he also knew many of those members of the NCRM, as well as Bob Santamaria, and I'm sure he can speak much more about those things right now. Over to you, Richard.
Thanks very much. I won't be as polished as Colin was in his paper. I'm going to shift around a little bit as I go. I'd just like to say that my interest in the National Catholic Rural Movement actually stemmed from the time when I was farming in the Southern Riverina, and my involvement with groups there when we were looking at economic issues at that time. It was a very difficult time for farming in the 90s when really we were suffering from basically liberal capitalism, you could describe it as, and the ongoing collectivisation of Australian agriculture at that time, where we saw a lot of farming families leaving. I got interested when I came across a rural movement leaflet, and then I started to do my research. I'd like to start by just saying that out of the National Secretariat of Catholic Action, it was often regarded that the rural movement was the jewel in the crown of lay involvement. It was formally mandated in 1940, reached a membership of somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 people, with as much as 10,000 issues of its newspaper being issued every month. Its most significant presence was actually in Victoria, in the smaller farming areas, really because it was close to where the Campion movement had been active. And people like Hennessy, I think it was Wangaratta at the time, had founded the Assisting Guild, was member of the rural movement, member of the Campion movement, played a fairly key role in galvanising people. As a movement, it's an interesting one. It bears a lot more investigation. It had a very large number of initiatives. It had active links with the Murray Valley Development League, the New England State Movement, and a whole heap of others. It also had allies in quite unpredictable people like socialist Lloyd Ross, and Barbara Ward, and also people like Colin Clark played a key role later on, not in the formation of the rural movement, but ultimately in articulating and outlining plans for it. Cooperatives were a really big part of it. It established a very large number of cooperatives, was responsible for the passing of legislation in the Victorian Parliament that made credit unions possible. It was also very deeply involved with the campaign for immigration and opening up immigration to Australia from non-British sources, whether they be from Holland, France, Italy, and ultimately from Asia. It was opposed to the White Australia policy. So many of these things that we see in the rural movement, we accept as a given in modern day Australian society. Yet, in a sense, what the rural movement ultimately aimed at, it actually failed. And I would argue that it failed because of the shift in the cultural dynamic in Australia. More about that later on. The rural movement really gained its inspiration from the Campions. And it's really interesting when you're looking at the Campion movement, we see activism coming from everywhere, them forming groups, getting their reading lists together and being involved in debates like the Spanish Civil War debates. But the really thing that's interesting about it was the role of Hackett. Father Hackett was a fairly, I don't know, not a very public figure in it, but he had exercised an enormous influence in terms of people he patronised and the literature that he got in. And he brought to that library, when they had the Central Catholic Library, not only books from the British tradition, but he brought in newspapers from the United States. So the Campion members were deeply aware, many of them, of what was happening in the United States and Roosevelt and New Deal. This is a time when people are thinking that Australians are all thinking about Britain, peasantry, things like that, the Belloc, Chesterton, but they're not realising that the massive influence that the United States is actually having on their thought. And at this time in history, the 1930s and the Great Depression, we've got Roosevelt and with his New Deal, and he's got regulations. He's taking out large amounts of land out of production. He's trying to control agricultural prices, and he's also trying to get more people back onto the land and self-sufficiency, and they're trying all kinds of experiments there with that. And the Catholic Church in America was played a really big role in this. We had Father John Ryan, we had Monsignor Laguti. Ryan was of the National Catholic Welfare Conference, and Laguti was head of the National Catholic Rural Life Movement. And Ryan had a pretty personal ear to Roosevelt. They were getting government funding for things. It was a really exciting time for Catholic activists in the United States. Now, this has to be played against a bit of a background with what was happening with Catholic action at that time, because when we see the development of Catholic social thought in Europe that had really dominated the Catholic Church, we've got a fairly splintered situation. And it's a splintered situation because of the French Revolution and the way that people reacted to that, how they reacted to Napoleon. So we get the development of fairly polarised groups. One group which is very much wedded to a liberal economy and personal action, and another group that seeks government action to solve the problems of the day. And we see that divided between the schools of Angers and Liège. And out of this comes the Jossist movement, of course. This movement that seeks to transform the world through personal action whilst steering clear of politics. And we could attribute that also to the clamping down on Catholic action movements in Europe during the 1930s by Mussolini and then by Hitler. It's probably an oversimplified thing that I'm giving, but this situation didn't quite affect the United States. The United States was very much the idea that, yes, we do get involved politically, we can transform things. Probably the other division there was Dorothy Day. Dorothy Day, you found, the Catholic worker movement there was definitely not a Jossist, and she definitely didn't believe in using politics either. She was really, really radical. But the overwhelming movement in the United States was this idea of using government to implement Catholic social programs that you could do. Now, a number of Campions, the Santa Maria wasn't alone in this. You can see, obviously, Hackett was there. Jackson was in it. Maguire, who was a fellow traveller of the Campions from Adelaide, was definitely this way inclined, and so was Ma. And Hennessy was also. So quite a lot of Campions were in this particular group, where they thought that they should pursue what they call the apostolate of institutions, where you infiltrate institutions and you use your superior understanding of culture, of faith, of history to transform those institutions to create a Christian society. In this, they were pursuing the ideas of Christopher Dawson, who always talked about the historian, very popular in the 1930s and 40s, who wrote about the power of the minority, to get in there and transform society. You don't wait for the average Joe in society to change things. You get in there, you get into the institutions, and you create an environment that's conducive to Christianity. Now, this means getting involved in politics, quite the opposite of the Justice movement. It means creating organisations, and it means getting fellow travellers to infiltrate these. I don't like using the word to infiltrate, but to actually get into these organisations and to guide them. So when the rural movement was established, as many of you would know, that the ANSCA was the brain child of Kevin Kelly, but it was actually Santa Maria who was given the job to run ANSCA, and Santa Maria was given the job to run the National Catholic Rural Movement without a rural background, but very much imbued with this thought that society could be rebuilt or built again by getting people into a rural culture through decentralisation, but through being modern, as the objective was in the United States. So it wasn't looking back at a European peasantry, it was looking at the idea of using modern day technology to create an anti-capitalist kind of society where people would be able to be self-sufficient, they would have enough work to feed themselves and be able to work in the factory maybe part-time. That was part of their plan of what they wanted to do. It was the exact plan of what they had in the United States. So they wanted to copy this kind of program. They saw their role as educating rural groups. In 1937, they did do an inquiry. They got all the parishes they could to form groups and write a submission to them and tell them what was wrong about rural life. Very, very interesting replies came back. Not all of them agreed with what they were thinking, and so their idea was to actually educate the rural groups. So their idea was to create a mass movement in the countryside where they could give the message that it was giving to American rural groups. That was to teach them the dignity of farming, to improve their quality of life on the farm, such as putting more care into their home instead of their machinery, and also to get them, farmers, to be active in their local institutions and societies to improve farm life and to bring pressure for closer settlement and to get government support for those things. The they faced a lot of obstacles in what they're doing. It just wasn't Santa Maria, by the way, running this. I mean, you've got people like Maguire, Hennessy, Hackett, doing everything that they could to support this movement. They believed that they could only do so much with these groups at first, that the ultimate quest was to enlist government to support them in things like regulation of prices, of regulation of finances through banking, and money to encourage closer settlement, decentralisation. That went through a period, I think, of about three main phases. It's sort of like, it diverges a bit. You've got the battle for the groups and what they're supposed to achieve, and then you've got the battle for the national organisation of what that was supposed to achieve. They felt that World War II gave them a wonderful opportunity to remake Australia. We had the creation of the Rural Reconstruction Commission, and the idea was at that time that Australia would be totally economically and socially reformed after World War II. And really it was inspired by the New Deal, largely in America. They thought that they could create large programs, irrigation, things like that. And the idea was to influence this Rural Reconstruction Commission. It ultimately failed, even though they had the loyalty of a fellow by the name of Murphy on the Rural Reconstruction Board. The reason was that Chifley, when he came to power, made sure that there would be no emphasis on rural development. He was interested in industrial development. So that failed. The next battle then, they moved from that to going with Labor governments around the country to encourage migration. They worked on that one. They had agreements from Holland, Italy to send migrants, so very much promoting this multicultural migration to Australia. But it hit a real big roadblock because of basically racism in Australia at that time, that politicians became very, very sensitive about non-British migrants. They were a bit of an electoral problem when they went to elections. So various governments, refused to cooperate, and ultimately it was the federal government. Santa Maria had never been a fan of Menzies. Menzies, I try and remember his famous quote when he went to New York in the 1930s, referred to trains full of wops and dagos. The human cargo of wops and dagos, I think is what he referred to. Menzies was not favourable to Italian migration at all, and so what we got was a blocking of rural movement attempts at that level. But what was happening on the local level is that they continued to push with ideas of settlement and with developing cooperatives, credit unions. And it's quite amazing the achievements that were made. As I said, we had up to 5,000 members. It's probably means about 5,000 families in Australia. They funded the settlement of migrants in, I'm trying to remember the name of the area now, I've just forgotten it, just outside of Melbourne. There were several hundred migrants settled by the rural movement in just that area alone. In the 1950s, there were rural settlements like Maryknoll, St Isidore were created, and over 50, I think it's over 50 credit unions at one stage, with some millions of pounds on their books. So they actually got, one of those societies was still existing right into the 1980s, Hume Building Society, one of them. And they also played a big role in ultimately in developing the idea of cooperatives and providing finance to develop those ideas in both Indonesia and in the Philippines. So Santa Maria felt that by the 1950s, late 50s, he'd failed in this dream. But I think that the rural movement actually did achieve a lot in terms of the personal actions of its members. I think that it played it's very hard to quantify, but the fact that they were very much against the White Australia policy, very much working towards the settlement of refugees and migrants in their communities, promoting cooperatives, promoting credit unions to change their society around them. I think that it's hard to quantify, but I think they played a vital contribution in the 1950s and 60s in creating part of what we recognise as Australia today. So whilst it failed as a movement to change institutions, I think that this very motivated core of people did in the 1950s contribute to a change in Australian culture. I think looking back, we've heard many things about the rural movement, and we've heard things about various Campion members and their designs for a society. We have to remember that their motivation was Catholic in the essence, and it was to create a non-capitalist society and a broad society. Whilst they failed in the institutions, I think they succeeded in a lot of ways with individuals and individual communities. And I think it's worthwhile a lot more study in that process. There's a lot more that I've skipped over. I've skipped over the split. I've skipped over, debates about between justice personalism and, the apostolate of institutions, and I've skipped over what was happening a lot in the United States. But I think that that's probably the best thing is to end it there and go on to a discussion of it.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yeah, well, I have to admit there's a lot of things there that I was pretty much totally unaware of. I knew the National Catholic Rural Movement by name, but I'm pretty much astounded to hear of that huge number of initiatives that they launched, and even major things. Well, that new state movement in New I didn't know anything. I knew about that movement. I didn't know anything about the National Catholic Rural Movement having anything to do with it. And of course, the immigration thing, which has been so important. And even I'm thinking of today, where we're concerned with the environment and the Pope's encyclical on Laudato Si. Perhaps there's a lot really to look back on in terms of the work of the National Catholic Rural Movement. So thanks very much for that. Yep,
it's one of those things I missed actually, was the one of the areas in agriculture they were really interested in was diversification and sustainability and organic agriculture. They were very much pioneers in that in Australia.
Great. Yep, well, a lot of things to pick up on. I'm going to hand over to Tony now, who's going to facilitate questions and comments and sharings from hopefully from some of our Campion descendants. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you. And first of all, apologies for those that tried to use the chat. I didn't realise the settings restricted your access, but those settings have now changed and you can send messages to everyone. So thank you for people that have been making a few observations and comments there. We prepared it. I'll just take you through. I'm going to ask Carl to speak a little bit about his dad. And we've got some lovely images on a PowerPoint. So I might just pull up a couple of images, Carl, and by way of response, just get you to perhaps fill in some of the story and history that's part of these images. So I'll just pull them up. Let's just find it. Here we are. I'm just having a little problem with the images here. Just bear with me. Okay, and here we are. So Carl, I might just get you to make some comments on a couple of these images and by way of response. Whoops. So Carl, could you unmute?
I'm just, thank you for that. I'm delighted that there is a range of Campion descendants with us this evening. I think that's wonderful. And I might just speak briefly just to supplement really, I suppose, and fill out a little what Colin described in his presentation. My dad was a Victorian, a country Victorian. He's born in Rutherglen, went to school, primary school in Yarrawonga, and then secondary school at Assumption College, Kilmore, and moved to Albury. His family moved to Albury while he was at Assumption. So he, I think, in a way, I suppose, embodies the Campion spread to rural areas, which Richard's presentation highlighted and explained so well. Albury, Wagga, most obviously, as well as other areas. The images that were just there were just an early one, just in the late 1920s of my father as a young man. And then the later ones was when he worked and edited for E.J. Dwyer in Sydney, a book review organ called Dwyer's Book Review. But anyhow, he had, as Colin mentioned, a significant library, and the mum and dad moved to Vaucler's house, and I grew up there. I suppose at the age of 9 I moved. I was vaguely aware of who William Charles Wentworth was, but only later, I guess, did I see the sort of connection between one of the Australian pioneers and the pioneering enterprise of the Campion Society, whose tradition I very much inherited through my father, and the books, particularly Chesterton, Belloc and Christopher Dawson. So when it comes to later activities, Dawson was and Chesterton were crucial figures in the thinking through of a Catholic liberal arts college, Campion College as it became, that opened in 2006. And I guess what Colin's and Richard's presentations highlight is how difficult it is to sustain these movements beyond a single or 2 generations. And that's been common enough. Basic reason why I felt it was so important to create an institution was to provide some continuity of activity and leadership across the generations. And that's it's not guaranteed in an institution, but it's far more likely than if one is simply dependent on the the founding spirits as they move on. They may be transmitting that to their immediate children, but much harder with subsequent generations. So one other point, just briefly, I might mention, which is relevant to my dad, was the importance of the Central Catholic Library and Father William Hackett. As was mentioned, his interest in lands outside of England, particularly the US, as Richard highlighted, it paved the way, I think, in a way for my father's interest in later years in European Catholic literature and history, particularly the French. So Dad actually wrote a book studying people like Georges Bernanos and Charles Péguy and Léon Blois. So he retained, of course, and cherished his love of the authors that he'd grown up with through the Campion Society. But in a way, he followed a Hackett path and moved beyond that to embrace other manifestations of the Catholic intellectual renaissance of the 20th century. Thanks, Tony.
I just, so Carl, I totally agree with you about the generational issue, that it was felt by the leaders of the rural movement that by the 1950s, they had lost that generational impetus that they had in the late 30s, where people had a real grasp of changing society. There was a new wave of affluence coming through to rural areas at that time. So I think it's really, really true that it's very hard to maintain things past a generation.
Thanks, Carl and Richard, for that response. I'd like to open up more, and in particular, we have a number of representatives from the Kelly family. I might just go back and just again, we've looked at lots of text, just to look at, in fact, if we just take the slideshow from the beginning, just to, both Colin and Richard and Richard's papers are available as PDFs, which is very useful. This is a great photo. This is really interesting. On the Wikipedia item about Bob Santa Maria, this is not a photo of Santa Maria and Mannix. It's a photo of Santa Maria with Archbishop Bewick. And in fact, Bewick became disillusioned later on with Santa Maria. And it's quite intriguing that this is the image that Wikipedia have used. Some of the lovely bits of historical stuff. This is the Campion's gift to B.A. Santa Maria on the occasion of his wedding. And if you can, I think, then there's a whole lot of names there that are probably, some other people here would know something of these names. So again, a wonderful piece of history. And also, I'm a bit of a closet archivist. I really believe, and I'd love to hear, and it's good that Richard and Colin have their papers available, but stuff like this, the archival history of any community, of any group of people is really significant. And little bits and pieces like this tell us so much about our community and our relationships. And I'd really encourage people that may have archival stuff. Hopefully we can gather that together somewhere. We have a number of members of the Kelly family. And I just wonder whether anyone from the, and the other good thing is, we've got women from the Kelly family. We've been listening to men all night. I wonder whether any of the women from the Kelly family would like to perhaps share. They've shared a couple of images here tonight. So Jacinta or anyone, one of the Kellys, would you like to make a comment about Kevin's contribution? This is Kevin's graduation photo, and this is, again, the Kelly family has allowed us to share this image of the Campion Society on a walk about 1934 with Bill Hackett Kevin Kelly and a number of those early members. Obviously, suits were okay to wear on bushwalks, no matter what the terrain was like. And it's obviously a very rough terrain. But what I want to know, as a photographer, I would love to know, because I imagine the photographer at the time was carting a tripod and a very heavy camera along. So I'm hoping they didn't trudge too far for the photographer's sake. So we're grateful for the Kelly family for those images. And Carl, yeah, and now Carl, you did make a comment that in a previous life you had red hair. You didn't comment about whether you inherited your father's athletic skills.
No, a very undistinguished record in that area. Actually, my wife and my 4 sons have lots of talent in football, cricket, and other sports. And one of my sons, when this was explained, said, "Well, sometimes, Dad, coordination skips a generation."
Well, I'm pretty impressed with that head of red hair there, yes, Carl.
If only it was still the case. But anyhow, it looks nice to regard in retrospect.
Stefan, I wonder if you might speak a little bit about the website and the aim of the website, because that's quite significant too in the ongoing story or capturing this history.
Yes, well, you know, the more we listen to people, the more we realise we've hardly touched on the subject. It's a brief introduction, and hopefully we can inspire a new generation of students who might take it a bit further, look into all those documents. So that's kind of an outcome of tonight's event. I've started a little website. I'll put it in the chat in a minute. But anyway, it's campion.australianinstitute.org. And maybe you can share the screen when you get a chance, Tony, because I'm not good enough to do that on the one go.
Yep, okay, yep.
But anyway, I'll put it in the chat. Will be the easiest way for everybody. And yeah, look, it'll be great. I've already had offers of a number of photos, and Carl's going to write up a short biography of his dad. Other biographies we can find online. I started to compile a bit of a biography of Gerard Heffy, just from little bits and pieces, but there's lots more that could be added. And this will also be a resource, you know, if we can say where the archives are so that students can find them. I know from my own research, often it's a hugely time-consuming and daunting task to actually find where documents are, who's got them. So yeah, possibly that website could be a resource for those future researchers.
Pat was wanting to say something. Pat, yeah.
Yes, Richard has gone into the history up to the 50s, I suppose. I was just wanting to know what it was the end of the NCRM, which is what I'm interested in. I was involved with the movement at Sydney Uni, and somehow or other I got lobbed into representing the NCRM on the road, and I always imagined that I probably finished it off. But Terry Fromholtz was my predecessor. But I heard Richard seem to be mentioning something with NCRM in the 90s. So I was just wondering, when was the last activity?
Look, yeah, that's a good question. I think Santa Maria resigned in 58, and I think Paul Wild was the last one I knew running it, and it's a funny. It was a bit like the last Japanese soldier in the Pacific, you know. It ceased as a pretty well by the 60s, late 60s. At 1970, it ceased as a proper, you know, organisation. Obviously, it was no longer, you know, ANZCA was gone, and they tended to merge with the movement groups. They tend to be the same people. So when you had a movement meeting there, that was the rural movement people as well in those areas. but yeah, Paul is, it's 20 odd years since I spoke with Paul, and as I said, it's a bit hard to track because he didn't have those centralised files. The thing with the movement is that when it ceased to really function, it also created a lot of paperwork. So the amount of activities of the rural movement were the documentation's in inverse proportion to what was actually happening, if that makes sense. Like when it started, they were doing a lot of stuff and there's not a lot of documentation. And at the end, there's a great deal. So I think really basically, as far as I'm aware, the 1970s, late 70s, there were some group, people still call themselves a rural movement group. That,
yeah, around Holbrook and...
Yeah.
And...
the Howleys, people like that.
There was a bloke in what's the big town on the border?
Albury, Wodonga.
Albury, named Jim Keogh, and I see a Keogh on the line up here.
Yeah.
He was an old man when I saw him in the mid-70s.
Yeah, I did know some of them, but particularly, as I said, the Howley family, they were still going strong in the 90s. Very, very dedicated people. I remember he had ridden his bicycle all the way from there to Wagga to attend a rural movement meeting when he was about 18. So it would have been about 100 kilometres, I think. But those families, yeah, basically, as I said, they just merged with movement groups, and you know, they continued to be involved doing the same kind of work as you know, trying to influence organisations, councils, things like that. Yeah.
Can I just chip in there for a minute? The last functioning group of the National Catholic Rural Movement, as I knew it, was in Axedale, just out of Bendigo. And Axedale itself has a very interesting story into how that township came to be. But I think Bill McManus is a name that, Bill Manus is a name that comes to mind who was involved there, because I remember some of us in the 1980s went to the National Catholic Rural Movement Ball in Axedale, and they were raising funds because they had been involved in settling Vietnamese refugees after the war, at the end of the Vietnam War. So there was a group there that was quite active. But also I tried to get Frances Wild, who's Paul Wild's daughter, in on the conference, but unfortunately she was otherwise engaged tonight. She does have a lot of her father's papers and certainly a lot of the NCRM newsletters and things. So, you know, if there's an archive being set up, she would...
Paul was very much an industrial movement man who was, I suppose, put into the rural movement. He didn't really have that picture of the rural movement that the founders of the rural movement had. It was quite interesting because his particular picture was fighting communism, whereas the early ones were fighting capitalism. But you're quite right, like a lot of the rural movements, they did play a big role in settling refugees in their communities.
Greg asked a question about parishes, the parish-based stuff with the movement, and how important were parishes. Does anybody want to respond to that? We've already had some indication. But...
In the rural movement, the principle was that you had 12 people would form a group. After you got 12 people, you'd have to create a secondary group. And it was very much parish-based.
Yeah, can I comment on that, please? Can I come in on that? Yeah, Marie Ganley here from Queensland, actually, someone from north of the border. I'm currently writing a history of the Diocese of Rockhampton. The Catholic Rural Movement, I'm actually on loan, have the minutes of the Catholic Rural Movement in Bundaberg. Now, that movement, and which was a very strong Polish migration community right from the early 20th century. So they became very practical minded in terms of cooperating to purchase farm machinery. And so it didn't have a very strong political base to it at all, but it was very strongly parish based, led by a parish priest. Then the movement in Rockhampton was more the credit union sort of, led by two priests, Jack Lay and John Rasmussen. Now, they were legends in their right in terms of establishing that credit union movement, which eventually was taken over by the Capricorn Credit Union, which functions very strongly now. But those two areas function because they were parish-based, and clerics led the movement very strongly, but were very active men themselves in terms of coming from rural backgrounds. I think their family backgrounds were rural.
It's interesting what you say, because Rockhampton at that time had the highest number of vocations per capita of any diocese in Australia. And Bishop Hayes was a great advocate of the rural movement.
Yes. He
purchased a lot of land in the Yeppoon district for closer settlement. But when he died, that sort of disappeared. But I believe that a lot of that land has gone on to fund the Diocese of Rockhampton in subsequent years. Yeah.
That's yeah.
So where did you say your archives are? They're actually in Bundaberg, are they?
They do belong to the Bundaberg archive, but I live in Brisbane, and I have the rural movement archive, all of that material in my possession at the moment in Brisbane, but it will go back to Bundaberg for the Bundaberg archive, which is being kept by a woman called Catherine King.
It's interesting because it was the most active area outside of Victoria, was Rockhampton.
Yes.
Very, very active.
Yes, and I interviewed several people, particularly with the credit union movement in Rockhampton, several people who saw it from beginning to end, who were part of it from its start to its end, and they're actually in Emu Park. And but they work very closely with Jack Lay and John Rasmussen in their involvement in Rockhampton. But I found it quite interesting that we talked about the Catholic rural movement in a rural area like Bundaberg, and we talk about the credit union and not so strongly the Catholic rural movement in Rockhampton itself, like a city and country. There seemed to be, would that be the case, like you've been describing the rural movement on campuses, university campuses and so forth, but that's not the experience that I'm coming across as I interview people for this project.
No, well, in Victoria, they're very much farm-based, very much rurally based. Yeah.
Yep.
If you take Genmain in the Riverina, for instance, I mean, I still knew some of those characters who were involved in that in the 1990s. They're all farmers.
That's right.
The leadership's very much university-based, but the actual groups themselves in Victoria were really in the country, real farmers.
Yes, that literature is still filtering through to the Bundaberg parish. It's huge. However, there isn't an active, as you know, rural movement operating, but the literature that comes from the Campion Society, from all of this, still filters through to Bundaberg, but I'm not sure who is reading it.
When you say filter through, what do you mean by that, it filters through?
I was shown literature, the archivist was able to show me current literature that's coming from, what would it be, this National Civic Council?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that sort of material, I think would be a follow-up, wouldn't it, of the Campion Society and so forth. But there isn't a forum through which that sort of material is filtered.
Look, everyone, I've just noticed we're starting to lose it. We've been going for an hour and a half, which is extraordinary, and we could keep going, but people are starting to leave us, and we can probably, Stefan, do you want to bring it to a formal close? We will leave the forum open for people that want to chat, but perhaps there is a possibility of some sort of forum, particularly about archiving, as that is a really important. It's one of my passions, is how do we archive our history, and this is about how do we pass stuff on to a new generation when someone starts to ask questions. So, Stefan, do you want to bring the formal part to a close?
Well, yes, I'll do my humble duty, and I definitely would like to thank both of our keynote speakers, Colin and Richard, because they certainly, from my point of view, they've certainly opened up a lot of points and issues that I knew little about, and we can just see from the discussion how much more there is to learn. And yeah, for those who don't know us very well, the Australian Cardon Institute, we're a very humble kind of little institute, but we do have a very keen group of people working with us, and we'd definitely like to welcome you to join us, and we'd also like to work with you in your other capacities or institutions with which you're associated to promote this kind of research. And I think there's many kind of points that we've left unexploited tonight. For example, the YCW connection, the YCS link, more generally the Catholic Action, and of course there's just so many different angles that we could follow up on in future webinars. And I think sometime later in this year, we will try to do that. Next month, we do have another webinar, which actually I'll be one of the presenters at which we're going to look at Alphonse Guattari, a French theologian and philosopher of the 19th century, who developed the theory of induction, which became the basis of the C-Judge Acts. So when people talk about the inductive method of Vatican II, I credit Alphonse Guattari, who's also been lost to history, partly because firstly, he opposed the definition of papal infallibility at Vatican I, as did John Henry Newman, but that didn't do his reputation any harm. But the other bigger mistake that he made was, at the time of the French-German War of 1870, he joined a peace movement, which didn't go down very well in France at that time. So I'm going to bring back to life Alphonse Guattari next month. And we do have a number of others. Clara is going to join us in April for a session on Caroline Chisholm, the lay apostolate aspect again. And there'll be a few more coming up in the course of the year. So we invite you to keep in touch with us and also to join us as formal members. We only charge $12. It's kind of pitiful, really. But, you know, we'd love to have you on our books and develop our institute for the future and collaborate with so many of you. And finally, again, I'd just like to thank Colin and Richard for everything that they've shared with us tonight. And we look forward to future events. And I shouldn't forget Tony, who's masterfully looked after the technical aspects.